The dialogue begins with Socrates engaging in conversation with Callicles and Polus about the rhetorician Gorgias. Socrates has apparently just missed a public demonstration by Gorgias, which included him responding to questions posed by others. Curious about this reputation, Socrates sets out to find Gorgias, hoping to understand the nature of his craft and to discover what exactly he claims to know and teach. Gorgias asserts that he has the skill to answer any question convincingly and with precision, a claim Socrates decides to investigate. When asked to clarify, Gorgias' responses fail to satisfy Socrates. At first, Gorgias describes rhetoric as a science of speech, but Socrates challenges this by noting that rhetoric cannot be the science of speech in all contexts. For instance, it does not cover speech about medicine or health. Gorgias then insists that rhetoric deals solely with spoken language and excludes any form of physical or manual technique. Socrates counters this by pointing out that disciplines such as mathematics are non-verbal yet are clearly not forms of rhetoric. Persistently and with calm determination, Socrates continues pressing for a clearer definition of rhetoric's proper domain. Struggling to define rhetoric precisely, Gorgias claims that it pertains to the greatest and most admirable of human concerns. However, Socrates objects, observing that many practitioners of various trades also consider their work to be of the highest value. Gorgias is quick to accept this objection. Through a prolonged and thorough exchange, the two eventually reach common ground, agreeing that rhetoric is fundamentally the art of persuasion, and that this capacity to persuade is its defining feature and principal aim. The dialogue begins abruptly, immersing the reader directly into an ongoing exchange without any mention of prior circumstances or causes that prompted the discussion. This technique, characteristic of Plato's early Socratic works, creates a sense of immediacy and realism, as if the reader is witnessing a casual, spontaneous conversation rather than a staged philosophical debate. Several subtle cues in the setting, mentions of a feast having ended, time spent idly in the marketplace, and references to friends, emphasize the ordinary and familiar atmosphere. It becomes clear that the setting is Athens during the time of Socrates and Plato, and that the dialogue unfolds on a typical day among close acquaintances. This grounded and specific context later proves important for understanding the deeper themes of the exchange. The way the conversation moves forward also illustrates Socrates' method of dialogue. At each step, he poses clear and focused questions, refusing to move on until agreement is reached about the matter under discussion. This ensures that the conversation remains anchored in the topic at hand, as progression only occurs once the previous point has been settled. Instead of asserting uncontested claims, Socrates leads a shared search for understanding, supported by collective reflection. This collaborative process is the essence of dialogue, a movement toward truth through the interplay of differing perspectives. Without this dynamic exchange and mutual exploration, no true dialogue could occur. There is not a single philosopher in history who was as relentlessly committed to seeking the truth as Plato was, and this is visible above all in his style of writing. Plato never simply asserts, he offers no fixed doctrines, no rigid proclamations, only questioning, probing, and a constant battle against ignorance and uncertainty. He acknowledges that truth is vast, and even when he has views he believes are true, he continues to challenge them. This is absolutely crucial. Plato refuses to operate in the realm of mere opinion, unlike so many others who write as though their personal convictions were absolute truth. How can anyone be so certain when countless other perspectives contradict their own? Most philosophers either ignore these opposing perspectives or attempt to diminish them. They construct their works as fortresses, designed to shield their ideas from criticism and to present their opinions as valid beyond question. Plato does the opposite. He shares his perspective, but then deliberately looks for flaws in it. He prefers to find a mistake in his own reasoning rather than defend it at all costs, because he knows this is the only real path to truth. While others think about errors mainly to conceal them, Plato exposes his theories to as many possible challenges as he can. He works, in a sense, against himself, because if we are mistaken and unaware of it, we are trapped in falsehood. The thinker who allows for critique, who admits the possibility of error, is still in the same realm of ignorance as the rest of us, but his door to truth remains open. If he is wrong, he is still right in a deeper sense, because even his error becomes part of the process that leads toward truth. His theory is not truth itself, but an open path toward it. By contrast, to assert something with certainty while refusing to be wrong is the worst kind of thinking. It shuts down thought altogether. It reduces philosophy to mere rhetoric, a performance in which the goal is not to discover truth, but to say things in a way that seems true, regardless of whether they are, so long as the audience believes it. What's even worse, this kind of thinking is rarely only about deceiving others. It is almost always also about deceiving oneself. The greatest deceptions happen when the deceiver has first deceived himself into believing what he says. In such cases, falsehood is no longer seen as falsehood. It takes the place of truth, is held in the highest regard, and is pursued with the utmost conviction, because the person truly believes it must be defended. When someone has deceived himself, he will defend falsehood as if he were defending truth. And once this self-deception takes root, it becomes almost impossible to open one's eyes again. No one else can undo it. Only the person himself can change his state of mind. Even when others point out the mistakes, even when facts are laid bare that reveal the deception, it is still the individual's own mind that must acknowledge it. It is far easier to recover from a deception imposed on us by others than from one we impose on ourselves. For who can easily admit that he has been fooled by his own mind? Opinions become especially dangerous when we mistake them for truth. Opinion and truth are not the same thing. Opinions can sometimes lead us toward truth, but it is rare that they land us directly in its realm. Most human discussion takes place in the realm of opinion, which is why so much of it is meaningless, or even harmful. We overestimate our ability to reach truth, unaware of the illusions our own minds produce. We place far too much weight on our personal opinions and beliefs, while in Plato's epistemology, beliefs and opinions occupy the lowest categories. They are the farthest from truth. He understood this, and for that reason he never stopped questioning his own views, no matter how certain he felt about them. This is why Plato wrote in dialogue form. Dialogue presents multiple perspectives, with each answer open to further questioning. Rhetoric, by contrast, presents a single perspective and shields it from challenge. In dialogue there is a constant exchange of questions and answers. In rhetoric there is only an answer, with no questions. And if there are no questions, every answer appears correct. But without questions, can we even call it an answer at all? Plato recognized that no one can reach truth without first beginning to ask questions. The back and forth between Socrates and Gorgias becomes a striking example of this method. Socrates continues by expressing his wish to explore more deeply the nature of persuasion as used in rhetoric. He argues that many disciplines, including teaching, also involve persuasion in some form. In order for a student to grasp or accept the principles of any subject, the teacher must use reason to persuade them that the information offered qualifies as knowledge, understood as justified true belief. A mathematics instructor, for example, must convince students of the truth of an equation through demonstrations of how it functions, while a philosopher such as Plato must persuade others, through writing and discussion, of the truth in his philosophical insights, as Socrates does with his listeners. From this understanding, it becomes evident that persuasion is a component of several practices beyond rhetoric. Gorgias, as expected, accepts this point, and then claims that rhetorical persuasion is particularly concerned with questions of right and wrong. Socrates then shifts the focus slightly to examine the difference between knowledge and belief. He asserts that belief can be either false or true, whereas knowledge must necessarily be true. If it is false, it cannot be considered knowledge at all. He presents this as a basic truth of understanding, not open to dispute. From this distinction, it follows that one form of persuasion results in belief without knowledge, false belief, and another leads to true belief, which constitutes knowledge. Gorgias identifies the courtroom as the primary arena where rhetoric is practiced. However, he also admits that the kind of conviction produced in such settings, or in other public assemblies, is persuasive in nature, not instructive, meaning it creates impressions of right and wrong without actually teaching what is right or wrong. Gorgias further maintains that rhetorical speech has the power to persuade audiences on nearly any topic, despite not being a specialized knowledge of any particular field. In fact, he claims that in front of a crowd, a rhetorician without technical expertise can be more convincing than the actual expert in that discipline. This assertion captures the essence of rhetoric and leads directly into Socrates' fundamental distinction between true art and mere flattery. According to Socrates, this phenomenon reveals that someone without knowledge can be more persuasive among the uninformed than among the knowledgeable. This pattern holds true across all disciplines. The subject of rhetoric is not only significant in Plato's time, it carries even deeper relevance in our modern world. In fact, one could argue that rhetoric is more widespread and insidious today than it ever was in ancient Athens. Where once the rhetorician stood before a crowd in a physical space, trying to sway public opinion through speech, today we are surrounded by countless modern equivalents, voices on social media, podcasts, news channels, and YouTube, each acting as a new Gorgias, relentlessly working to persuade, influence, and manipulate. In antiquity, rhetoric had its place. It was expected in courts, assemblies, and public debates. But in today's world, rhetoric has no boundaries, it is everywhere, and it has become the dominant sound of our era. The modern speaker doesn't face live audiences or critical dialogue. Instead, they speak into cameras, unchallenged and unchecked, projecting their messages directly into the minds of viewers. There's no opposition, no Socratic questioning, only a constant stream of persuasive speech, tailored to convince. As Socrates once warned, the ignorant are the most easily persuaded. And today, we are witnessing the consequences of that truth. The sheer volume of information, opinions, and speculation has created a chaotic landscape where almost anyone can be misled. We are bombarded with content at every hour, morning or night, simply by unlocking our phones. No one is an expert in everything, and so anyone, at any time, can be drawn in by persuasive misinformation. This is the world we live in now, a world shaped by illusions. It has become clear that every one of us, without exception, has at some point been deceived by modern rhetoric. We've believed things that turned out to be false, often because they were presented convincingly in a video or post. Individuals, communities, even entire nations fall under the spell of these digital rhetoricians, whose influence is more pervasive and dangerous than ever. The line between fact and fiction has become blurred. Some even believe the Earth is flat, that space is an elaborate hoax, and that history is a fabrication controlled by secret cabals. This is not fringe anymore. It is a symptom of a much larger problem, a world drowning in rhetorical deception. It feels as though humanity is being pulled into a deepening abyss of lies, sinking further with each passing day, as these seductive, manipulative voices echo through every device, from the moment we wake until we close our eyes at night. Here lies the critical difference. Rhetoric, like other routines aimed at pleasing, stirs up enjoyment and creates the illusion of what is good, while the true arts reject immediate gratification in pursuit of what is genuinely good. Socrates therefore concludes that rhetoric is not a true art, but rather the pursuit of a clever and ambitious mind, someone adept at managing people, and in essence, he calls it flattery. This contrast applies more broadly to other fields, including physical training, healing, lawmaking, and justice. Sophistry stands in relation to legislation as cosmetics does to physical training, and rhetoric relates to justice in the same way that cookery relates to medicine. All true arts are based on reason and aim for the good, while routines merely seek what is pleasing and disregard the good altogether. The central idea is that the average person in a group setting is not inclined to engage in careful reasoning. Instead, most people, precisely because they are average, tend to follow whatever others are saying, whether it's the rest of the crowd or a persuasive speaker. Even their own internal reasoning is often superficial. This lack of thoughtful reflection stands in contrast to the rational, inward focus needed to grasp the truth of any situation. Once truth is genuinely understood, it determines the right course of action on its own. At the time this dialogue was written, this same public ignorance posed a threat to the very foundations of Athenian society. It could be argued that this very threat is what led Plato to compose Gorgias, as an urgent attempt to address the problem before irreversible damage occurred. Through this confrontation between real and false art, Plato begins to suggest, though not yet with full development, that the good is something entirely separate from the pleasant. The good, by nature, is genuinely valuable, while the pleasant only imitates goodness, creating a deceptive appearance that misleads people into false beliefs. Art holds real worth, whereas routine merely appears to. Although this distinction may seem simple, its consequences are profound. The discussion shifts toward an examination of power, with the enthusiastic Polus stepping in to take over from his teacher, Gorgias. Polus begins by asserting that power is something beneficial to the one who possesses it, essentially claiming that power lies in a person's ability to bring about what is good through their actions. This assertion leads Socrates to present a striking counterpoint. If this definition holds true, then those who rule as tyrants have the least power of all within their communities. At first, this claim may seem to defy common sense, but Socrates' reasoning quickly brings clarity. He explains that people do not desire actions for their own sake, but rather for the outcomes those actions aim to achieve. That is, individuals act not out of a will for the deed itself, but out of a will for the result it promises. This idea, Socrates suggests, can be applied broadly across all human activity. In the case of medicine, for instance, one does not willingly take a remedy because the act of consuming it is pleasant or desirable in itself, but because it leads to improved health. The goal, rather than the action, is what truly motivates. To put it plainly, when someone acts with a purpose in mind, it is that purpose, not the action itself, that is truly desired. This pattern is especially evident in the realm of the arts. Any practiced craft or discipline is pursued not for the process alone, but for the value of the result it produces. Someone does not engage in rigorous physical training for the sake of endless exertion, but for the health and vitality it cultivates, benefits that serve both body and soul, and thus enrich the person's overall life. This, according to Socrates, is the defining trait of a true art. It is good not in and of itself, but through the good it brings about, whether in justice, temperance, medicine, physical discipline, or any other refined practice. Building on this, Socrates turns to the example of the powerful ruler. He outlines situations in which a leader must carry out harsh actions, such as punishment or execution, for the perceived benefit of the state. In such cases, the ruler believes these actions are necessary and good, which would seem to align with Polus's definition of power as something good for the one who holds it. However, Socrates argues that even in these circumstances, the ruler does not truly desire the action itself, punishment or death, but rather the supposed good that follows from it. Just as a physician does not will the unpleasant remedy but its healing effect, so the tyrant does not will the cruel act but its outcome. Therefore, Socrates concludes, rulers who commit such acts out of necessity, rather than personal desire, reveal that they do not possess genuine power. Their actions are determined by what benefits the collective, not by an autonomous will. Thus, they are bound by the necessity of serving a larger good. While Plato may not have set out specifically to respond to the fate of Socrates, it is difficult not to view this conception of power as a partial vindication. Socrates, at the end of his life, chose to accept his punishment, insisting that true power remained within him, not in the hands of the authorities who carried out his sentence. Through this depiction, Plato gives lasting expression to that idea, confronting those who, like Polus, mistake outward force for genuine strength. This part of the dialogue, therefore, stands as a lasting testament to the resilience of the virtuous soul in the face of corrupt or misguided authority. Socrates continues his argument by asserting that doing wrong is worse than suffering it, a claim that Polus immediately challenges. Polus insists that many who commit wrongdoings live happily, seemingly untroubled by their actions. Socrates, however, maintains that those who act unjustly are inevitably unhappy, and that an even greater misery belongs to those who commit injustice and avoid punishment altogether. This leads to the immediate question of why someone who escapes the consequences of their wrongful deeds should be unhappy at all. To begin addressing this, Socrates makes the initially puzzling claim that committing injustice is more shameful than enduring it, and that this greater shamefulness also means it is worse. According to his reasoning, what is more shameful must also be more harmful. Polus disagrees, arguing that the concepts of what is good and what is noble are not necessarily the same, just as the evil and the shameful are not necessarily identical. While Socrates' position is clearly laid out, the argument remains difficult to grasp fully, as it relies on ethical distinctions that may initially appear vague or dependent on personal perspective. It is precisely through the structure of the dialogue that Plato attempts to give these ideas objective weight. Patiently, Socrates further clarifies that when two shameful things differ in their degree of disgrace, the greater must involve either more pain or more evil. The point here is that without causing pain or evil, an action cannot truly be considered harmful or shameful. It cannot produce real suffering. If no pain or moral harm is involved, then there is nothing to account for the suffering in question. Polus agrees with this line of thought. Since committing an injustice does not cause more physical pain than suffering one, yet is still considered more shameful, the excess must come from its greater evil. Therefore, to commit injustice is more evil than to suffer it. Eventually, Polus concedes this conclusion. Even more harmful, Socrates says, is committing wrong and not being punished. Both he and Polus accept that punishment brings justice by restoring balance to the harm already done. Socrates explains that the person who is punished suffers justly, enduring what is due in return for their misdeed. This leads him to assert that just punishment, rather than being an added harm, is actually beneficial. It purges the soul of wrongdoing. Thus, the one who commits injustice and is punished is, in a sense, relieved of a great moral burden, while the one who commits the same act and avoids punishment remains trapped in deeper corruption. As a result, Socrates concludes that it is far worse to commit injustice and evade punishment than to do wrong and be brought to justice. By the end of this exchange, even Polus is compelled to yield to Socrates' reasoning. While there is broad agreement that it is better not to commit injustice at all, the idea that punishment is preferable to impunity when wrongdoing has occurred can seem more a matter of personal outlook than of universal truth. That is, some may hold that if wrong is done, it should at least be followed by punishment to balance it, seeing this as the best possible outcome where wrongdoing is still involved. In contrast, someone with a corrupt nature would likely see things differently. For such a person, the ideal situation would be to commit injustice and escape all consequences. To them, punishment is an unwanted result, and avoiding it is the best outcome. From this perspective, being caught and punished is worse than getting away unscathed. Plato, however, does not shape his argument according to the preferences of the corrupt. Still, it is easy to understand how many, especially those inclined toward wrongdoing, might believe that escaping punishment is preferable. This is precisely the widespread error that Plato must correct if he is to preserve the idea that virtue is truly desirable. He must show why punishment for injustice is objectively preferable to impunity, even when such a claim feels unnatural. The misunderstanding that Polus exhibits is therefore not unusual, but rather quite typical. The difficulty of properly grasping this argument lies in the layered and subtle reasoning that Socrates brings to it. Concepts like shame, pain, evil, suffering, and justice are woven together into a complex structure, making the conclusion difficult to follow without close attention. Fortunately, Socrates is extraordinarily precise and careful in his speech, likely because Plato was aware of just how abstract and elusive this point might be to all but the most attentive and morally serious thinkers. The significance of this argument likely reinforced Plato's effort to construct such a carefully reasoned demonstration. This significance is rooted in several motives. First, Plato seems particularly concerned here with reconciling the unjust death of Socrates with the enduring virtue of the man himself. For his teacher's life and death not to have been in vain, Plato must demonstrate that even in dying, Socrates remains morally superior to the corrupt state that condemned him. The clearest way to do this is to show that the rulers, by committing a grave injustice and escaping punishment, are in fact worse off than Socrates. In this way, Plato's argument becomes a kind of philosophical resistance. The subject gains further weight because it introduces the first glimpse of a higher moral order within the dialogue. By elevating the notion of a just soul as the most noble human state, Plato begins to form a view of virtue as something abstract and hierarchical. He moves from specific examples of good and evil, right and wrong, to a broader philosophical vision. This method of building general moral principles through detailed examination of particular cases is not only central to Gorgias, but also characteristic of Plato's entire philosophical approach. Socrates proceeds by questioning the value or purpose behind the use of rhetoric. Still directing his inquiry toward Polus, he argues that this practice serves only those who intend to commit injustice, as its function lies solely in the act of persuasion through deceptive speech and a misleading appeal to what is pleasurable, rather than to what is genuinely good in any given situation. According to Socrates, rhetoric does not concern itself with truth, nor does it aim toward virtue. He then presents a series of striking and seemingly severe ideas about punishment for wrongdoing, which arise naturally from his previous conversation with Callicles regarding justice. Among these notions is the idea that one might actually wish for their enemy to go unpunished for their crimes, so that the evildoer suffers more in the long term. For example, Socrates imagines a case in which a person steals a great fortune and is never held accountable, which would lead to the worst possible outcome for that person. These ideas rely on earlier arguments about how punishment helps cleanse the soul from the damage caused by injustice, and how failing to punish wrongdoers allows their corruption to persist uncorrected within them. Callicles responds with frustration, clearly angered by what he perceives as Socrates' own form of manipulation, comparing him to a speaker who panders to the masses. He accuses Socrates of using argument only to confuse, misrepresent, and assign meaning to words that the speaker never intended. Callicles insists that Socrates seeks the good through social customs, rather than through the clearer guide of nature. Ultimately, Callicles declares that the pursuit of philosophy into adulthood is shameful, and he mocks Socrates' method of twisting others' statements as absurd and humiliating. Despite Callicles' hostility, Socrates remains composed and unwavering. In fact, Callicles' outburst weakens his own position, as he allows emotion to take control of the discussion. Socrates, by contrast, continues to rely on a steady method and logical consistency, even if some view his reasoning as sly, while Callicles and the others shift erratically between viewpoints, driven more by reaction than conviction. Socrates then tells Callicles that among all those present, he is the one best suited to examine the soul together with him, since he possesses the three essential traits: knowledge, honesty, and goodwill, qualities lacking in Gorgias and Polus. He even suggests that any conclusion reached between the two of them must represent the truth, precisely because they both hold these indispensable attributes. Plato clearly intended Socrates' words in this work to reflect the real person and his convictions. It was for such beliefs that Socrates was condemned, accused of corrupting the youth and showing disloyalty to the city, and ultimately executed. The same city that silenced Plato's teacher did so for expressing the same philosophical principles voiced here in the dialogue, only a few years before this text would have been composed. This offers clear evidence that the ruling powers in Athens harbored deep hostility toward philosophy, particularly the kind focused on ethics and self-examination. They did not hesitate to eliminate its most moral and principled representative. A society in which such a grievous judgment could be delivered and fulfilled must have been one of considerable cruelty or blindness, as otherwise the death of someone as kind and upright as Socrates could not have passed without protest. By including such a scathing denunciation of Socrates' lifelong devotion to philosophy, spoken by someone who is, at least nominally, a friend, Plato vividly captures the atmosphere of animosity that surrounded Socratic thought. His intention seems to be to ensure this injustice is neither forgotten nor repeated. Moreover, Socrates' calm endurance of this verbal assault in Gorgias mirrors his steadfastness in real life, a commitment to philosophy that he maintained even as he faced death. He continued to pursue wisdom and virtue until his final breath. In this way, the dialogues preserve the outrage that the world failed to express when it allowed such a man to be silenced. To address his own philosophical aims and to engage Callicles, Socrates turns his attention to the nature of justice. Callicles defines justice as natural justice, the strong rule over the weak through force, and the better govern the inferior. He equates power with being better, but agrees with Socrates that most people think justice means equal shares for everyone, equal opportunity, safety, and punishment alike. In such a just system, the privileges of the noble and powerful are extended equally to the base and weak. Challenging Callicles' view of justice as natural dominance, and despite a fresh wave of insults from Callicles, Socrates presents the example of a slave who, due to greater strength, might be better than the slave's owner. Surely, Callicles would reject the idea that such a lowly person should rule over the owner just because of superior physical strength, often a consequence of the slave's harsh labor. In response, Callicles revises his definition, claiming that the better and wiser should rule and possess more than the inferior. This prompts Socrates to investigate whether these rulers, and indeed all humans, truly govern themselves. This leads to the introduction of temperance, understood as mastery over one's own pleasures and desires. Callicles expresses disdain for temperance, insisting instead that true happiness and power come from allowing desires to grow without restraint. He views temperance as a weakness. Socrates counters with a metaphor of a leaking jar, illustrating that a soul with uncontrolled desires constantly craves more and can never be satisfied, just as a jar full of holes cannot retain water. For Socrates, justice means temperance of the soul and its desires. Callicles remains unconvinced, arguing that a full jar leaves no space for additional pleasure, so restraint and temperance are undesirable. Socrates seriously questions equating the good solely with pleasure. He explains that a craving, like thirst, is painful, while satisfying it, like drinking, is pleasurable. When someone eats to ease hunger, they experience both pleasure and pain simultaneously. But it is impossible to both fare well, a good, and fare badly, an evil, at the same time. Since eating produces concurrent pleasure and pain, it follows that pleasure cannot be the same as the good, nor pain the same as evil. Callicles agrees with this conclusion. Callicles' conception of justice reflects a common understanding within Plato's Athenian society. The corrupt ruling powers of the time themselves exemplify the idea of the strong and aggressive dominating the weak. After a period marked by deep internal turmoil, a power vacuum allowed those with sufficient force and the willingness to assert it to seize control and impose their own rules on society. This direct transformation of power into law and authority perfectly captures how many of Socrates' contemporaries defined justice. This scenario unfolded after the Peloponnesian War, when a group of corrupt, wealthy opportunists took control for their own benefit. By giving Callicles this perspective, Plato presents the dominant view he aims to challenge and dismantle in his inquiry. Socrates revisits the question of justice after temperance's value has been established through the clear separation of pleasure from the good. This distinction is further highlighted by examples, such as a coward and a brave man each feeling similar pleasure after a battle ends. Although the courageous man is more in possession of the good, since bravery is more virtuous than cowardice, there is little difference in the pleasure both experience. The coward, despite being worse, feels pleasure comparable to the better brave man. Similarly, A sensible person experiences pain and pleasure in amounts similar to those felt by a foolish person, a point Callicles agrees with. Likewise, wise and foolish individuals endure comparable levels of pleasure and pain, despite their differences in other respects. Thus, the distribution of good and bad does not correspond directly to the distribution of pleasure and pain. Consequently, Socrates asserts once again that the good cannot be equated with the pleasant, because if it were, these men, alternately good and bad, would not share equal amounts of pleasure. Since the quantities of good and bad differ from the simultaneous levels of pleasure and pain experienced in a body, as in the earlier example of the brave man and coward after battle, the two factors must be independent. Socrates then declares that the good is the ultimate goal of all actions, and everything else should be pursued for its sake. Furthermore, he emphasizes that the true focus of the discussion is what kind of life one should live, proper existence. From this statement, a key element of Gorgias takes shape. Proper existence, at the most abstract level, requires that all actions be performed for the sake of the good. How exactly this is to be done remains to be clarified. Socrates' next step toward answering this question returns to the earlier distinction between art and flattery. Both he and Callicles now accept this distinction, and their agreement allows them to press further toward their shared goal. Considering skills like painting and building, they conclude that all crafts involve establishing harmony through order and regulation within their particular domains. Thus, physical trainers and doctors bring order and discipline to the body, and all bodies, objects, and entities benefit from regulation while suffering from disorder. Finally, Socrates offers the clearest articulation of good living found in the dialogue. Order and discipline in the body produce health and strength, while order and regularity in the soul result in justice and temperance. Health, strength, justice, and temperance together define proper existence, as Socrates, and therefore Plato, understands it. By this stage in Gorgias, Socrates has nearly declared the central theme of the dialogue for any attentive listener. It is no accident on Plato's part that such a unifying current emerges into a clearer and more complete vision at this point. Throughout the dialogue, Socrates has persistently sought to understand the nature of the good life through various specific human endeavors, including health and politics. Most of the essential elements have now been thoroughly outlined. What remains is their integration and practical application in life by combining the abstract values and aims discovered here with the concrete choices and actions faced by every human. By positioning the good as the ultimate purpose behind all actions within a proper existence, Plato offers the reader a unifying principle. This works because each significant inquiry in the text can be interpreted in relation to how its conclusions connect with the good. In hindsight, this underlying thread is unmistakable. This is evident in Socrates' examinations of rhetoric, art, routine, pleasure, power, justice, and temperance. Each is explored with regard to how it interacts with and attains the good. Moreover, the orderly and harmonious progression of the philosophical discussion closely reflects the structure of the good itself. In other words, a person must cultivate health, strength, justice, and temperance individually, but only when these qualities are combined and harmonized does proper existence arise. Good living is nothing other than the integration of these aspects for the sake of the good. Likewise, Socrates' methodical investigation of these qualities requires careful reflection. Each attribute must be considered separately, but it is only through their eventual interaction, such as understanding justice through temperance, that a harmonious vision of good living emerges. The larger, overarching question gains meaning entirely from the synthesis of these smaller inquiries. This pattern reveals how deeply Plato valued the formula of harmony achieved through order and regulation. It not only represents the proper ordering of body and soul in the pursuit of a good life, but also prescribes a fitting structure for this fundamental philosophical inquiry itself. Socrates spends the remainder of Gorgias elaborating, often at length, on the development and centrality of virtue. He begins by asserting that a sound-minded and temperate individual is inherently just, pious, and brave, and thus entirely good and happy. In contrast, an evil person, whose greatest wrongdoing is to commit injustice and avoid punishment, lives a shameful and miserable life. Moreover, Socrates insists that matters of the soul hold far greater importance for good living than those of the body. This is because the soul embodies the most refined and complex parts of a person, contains their true nature, and allows for participation in eternity through immortality, at least according to Plato's view as expressed elsewhere. When Callicles voices doubt about Socrates' claims, Socrates attributes this to Callicles' ongoing confusion of pleasure with the good, using familiar terms that distinguish true from false arts. Socrates then stresses the necessity of applying virtue and proper living to the city and its citizens, aiming to make them as virtuous as possible. He carefully explains how leaders often govern based on pleasure and the approval of their subjects, which ultimately leads to future generations suffering the consequences when the pleasant replaces the good. He illustrates this with the example of a chariot driver who avoids being thrown off in his first race but cannot maintain his seat in later races. No one would consider such a driver skilled, just as no one should regard a political leader who behaves similarly as a good ruler. Socrates rejects any action or belief that mistakes excitement or pleasure for the true good. He faults such leaders for the swollen and festering condition of Athenian society. In a moment heavy with foreshadowing, Socrates claims to be one of the few practitioners of the true art of politics and lawmaking, predicting that if he were to face trial, an unjust man would prosecute him, and he would very likely be sentenced to death. The dialogue closes with Socrates recounting a myth concerning death. Listen then, as storytellers say, to a very pretty tale, which I dare say that you may be disposed to regard as a fable only, but which, as I believe, is a true tale, for I mean to speak the truth. Homer tells us how Zeus and Poseidon and Pluto divided the empire which they inherited from their father. Now in the days of Cronos there existed a law respecting the destiny of man, which has always been, and still continues to be in heaven, that he who has lived all his life in justice and holiness shall go, when he is dead, to the islands of the blessed, and dwell there in perfect happiness out of the reach of evil, but that he who has lived unjustly and impiously shall go to the house of vengeance and punishment, which is called Tartarus. And in the time of Cronos, and even quite lately in the reign of Zeus, the judgment was given on the very day on which the men were to die. The judges were alive, and the men were alive, and the consequence was that the judgments were not well given. Then Pluto and the authorities from the islands of the blessed came to Zeus, and said that the souls found their way to the wrong places. Zeus said, "I shall put a stop to this. The judgments are not well given, because the persons who are judged have their clothes on, for they are alive, and there are many who, having evil souls, are apparelled in fair bodies, or encased in wealth or rank, and when the day of judgment arrives, numerous witnesses come forward and testify on their behalf that they have lived righteously. The judges are awed by them, and they themselves too have their clothes on when judging. Their eyes and ears and their whole bodies are interposed as a well before their own souls. All this is a hindrance to them. There are the clothes of the judges and the clothes of the judged. What is to be done? I will tell you. In the first place, I will deprive men of the foreknowledge of death, which they possess at present. This power which they have Prometheus has already received my orders to take from them. In the second place, they shall be entirely stripped before they are judged, for they shall be judged when they are dead, and the judge too shall be naked, that is to say, dead. He with his naked soul shall pierce into the other naked souls, and they shall die suddenly and be deprived of all their kindred, and leave their brave attire strewn upon the earth. Conducted in this manner, the judgment will be just. I knew all about the matter before any of you, and therefore I have made my sons judges, 2 from Asia, Minos and Rhadamanthus, and 1 from Europe, Aeacus. And these, when they are dead, shall give judgment in the meadow at the parting of the ways, whence the 2 roads lead, one to the islands of the blessed, and the other to Tartarus. Rhadamanthus shall judge those who come from Asia, and Aeacus those who come from Europe. And to Minos I shall give the primacy, and he shall hold a court of appeal, in case either of the 2 others are in any doubt. Then the judgment respecting the last journey of men will be as just as possible. From this tale, Callicles, which I have heard and believe, I draw the following inferences. Death, if I am right, is in the first place the separation from one another of two things, soul and body, nothing else. And after they are separated they retain their several natures, as in life. The body keeps the same habit, and the results of treatment or accident are distinctly visible in it. For example, he who by nature or training or both was a tall man while he was alive, will remain as he was after he is dead, and the fat man will remain fat, and so on, and the dead man who in life had a fancy to have flowing hair will have flowing hair. And if he was marked with the whip, and had the prints of the scourge, or of wounds in him when he was alive, you might see the same in the dead body, and if his limbs were broken or misshapen when he was alive, the same appearance would be visible in the dead. And in a word, whatever was the habit of the body during life would be distinguishable after death, either perfectly, or in a great measure and for a certain time. And I should imagine that this is equally true of the soul, Callicles. When a man is stripped of the body, all the natural or acquired affections of the soul are laid open to view. And when they come to the judge, as those from Asia come to Rhadamanthus, he places them near him and inspects them quite impartially, not knowing whose the soul is. Perhaps he may lay hands on the soul of the great king, or of some other king or potentate, who has no soundness in him, but his soul is marked with a whip, and is full of the prints and scars of perjuries and crimes with which each action has stained him, and he is all crooked with falsehood and imposture, and has no straightness, because he has lived without truth. Him Rhadamanthus beholds, full of all deformity and disproportion, which is caused by license and luxury and insolence and incontinence, and dispatches him ignominiously to his prison, and there he undergoes the punishment which he deserves. Now the proper office of punishment is twofold. He who is rightly punished ought either to become better and profit by it, or he ought to be made an example to his fellows, that they may see what he suffers, and fear and become better. Those who are improved when they are punished by gods and men are those whose sins are curable, and they are improved, as in this world so also in another, by pain and suffering, for there is no other way in which they can be delivered from their evil. But they who have been guilty of the worst crimes, and are incurable by reason of their crimes, are made examples. For, as they are incurable, the time has passed at which they can receive any benefit. They get no good themselves, but others get good when they behold them enduring for ever the most terrible and painful and fearful sufferings as the penalty of their sins. There they are, hanging up as examples, in the prison house of the world below, a spectacle and a warning to all unrighteous men who come thither. And among them, as I confidently affirm, will be found Callicles, if Polus truly reports of him, and any other tyrant who is like him. Of these fearful examples, most, as I believe, are taken from the class of tyrants and kings and potentates and public men, for they are the authors of the greatest and most impious crimes, because they have the power. And Homer witnesses to the truth of this, for they are always kings and potentates whom he has described as suffering everlasting punishment in the world below. Such were Tantalus and Sisyphus and Titius. But no one ever described Thersites, or any private person who was a villain, as suffering everlasting punishment, or as incurable. For to commit the worst crimes, as I am inclined to think, was not in his power, and he was happier than those who had the power. No, Callicles, the very bad men come from the class of those who have power, and yet in that very class there may arise good men, and worthy of all admiration they are, for where there is great power to do wrong, to live and to die justly is a hard thing, and greatly to be praised, and few there are who attain to this. Such good and true men, however, there have been, and will be again, at Athens and in other states, who have fulfilled their trust righteously, and there is one who is quite famous all over Hellas, Aristides, the son of Lysimachus. But, in general, great men are also bad, my friend. As I was saying, Rhadamanthus, when he gets a soul of the bad kind, knows nothing about him, neither who he is, nor who his parents are. He knows only that he has got hold of a villain, and seeing this, he stamps him as curable or incurable, and sends him away to Tartarus, whither he goes and receives his proper recompense. Or again, he looks with admiration on the soul of some just one who has lived in holiness and truth. He may have been a private man or not, and I should say, Callicles, that he is most likely to have been a philosopher who has done his own work, and not troubled himself with the doings of other in his lifetime. Him Rhadamanthus sends to the islands of the blessed. Aeacus does the same, and they both have sceptres and judge, but Minos alone has a golden scepter and is seated looking on, as Odysseus in Homer declares that he saw him, holding a scepter of gold, and giving laws to the dead. Now I, Callicles, am persuaded of the truth of these things, and I consider how I shall present my soul whole and undefiled before the judge in that day. Renouncing the honours at which the world aims, I desire only to know the truth, and to live as well as I can, and when I die, to die as well as I can. And to the utmost of my power, I exhort all other men to do the same. And in return for your exhortation of me, I exhort you also to take part in the great combat, which is the combat of life, and greater than every other earthly conflict. And I retort your reproach of me, and say, that you will not be able to help yourself when the day of trial and judgment, of which I was speaking, comes upon you. You will go before the judge, the son of Aegina, and when he has got you in his grip and is carrying you off, you will gape and your head will swim round, just as mine would in the courts of this world, and very likely someone will shamefully box you on the ears, and put upon you any sort of insult. Perhaps this may appear to you to be only an old wife's tale, which you will contemn. And there might be reason in your contemning such tales, if by searching we could find out anything better or truer. But now you see that you and Polus and Gorgias, who are the three wisest of the Greeks of our day, are not able to show that we ought to live any life which does not profit in another world as well as in this. And of all that has been said, nothing remains unshaken but the saying, that to do injustice is more to be avoided than to suffer injustice, and that the reality and not the appearance of virtue is to be followed above all things, as well in public as in private life, and that when anyone has been wrong in anything, he is to be chastised, and that the next best thing to a man being just is that he should become just, and be chastised and punished, also that he should avoid all flattery of himself as well as of others, of the few or of the many, and rhetoric and any other art should be used by him, and all his actions should be done always with a view to justice. The tone and subject matter here notably diverge from the style seen in previous sections. Socrates' speech grows urgent and extended, with fewer pauses for others to respond. His delivery borders on oratory, a style unusual for Socratic and Platonic dialogues. Applying the concept of virtue directly, Socrates condemns false leaders and corrupt politicians who rely on deception through pleasure rather than pursuing truth for the good. He insists that virtue, once cultivated internally, must be applied to one's city and fellow citizens. Plato has Socrates predict the nature of his own death in a remarkable decision, especially since the dialogue was completed after Socrates' trial and execution had occurred. Socrates' death, inflicted by the very tyrannical evil he condemns, came because he lived according to the good life he defines in the dialogue. This historical context adds profound meaning to the entire work, particularly its final part. By concluding with the story of judgment after death, Plato achieves several aims. The myth shows that Socrates need not fear death. Having lived virtuously, he enters eternal happiness, the very outcome of the proper existence described. This notion helps reconcile Socrates' followers, especially Plato, with his execution. The depiction also comforts readers by affirming that all evildoers, especially corrupt tyrants like Socrates' executioners, ultimately receive punishment proportional to their wrongdoing, whether in life or after death. This understanding further addresses the apparent injustice of Socrates' death. Ultimately, the account underscores the fundamental importance of virtue to human existence. The attainment of this composite art of proper living determines the nature of one's existence throughout eternity. Given this immense significance, it is unsurprising that virtue and the good life are the central themes of this dialogue and a persistent focus of Plato's lifelong philosophical inquiry. As Socrates' last words in the dialogue say, "Follow me then, and I will lead you where you will be happy in life and after death," as the argument shows. And never mind if someone despises you as a fool and insults you if he has a mind. Let him strike you by Zeus, and do you be of good cheer, and do not mind the insulting blow, for you will never come to any harm in the practice of virtue, if you are a really good and true man. When we have practiced virtue together, we will apply ourselves to politics, if that seems desirable, or we will advise about whatever else may seem good to us, for we shall be better able to judge then. In our present condition we ought not to give ourselves airs, for even on the most important subjects we are always changing our minds, so utterly stupid are we. Let us, then, take the argument as our guide, which has revealed to us that the best way of life is to practice justice and every virtue in life and death. This way let us go, and in this exhort all men to follow, not in the way to which you trust and in which you exhort me to follow you, for that way, Callicles, is nothing worth.